Appreciate having a chance to speak. My name is Nathan Henry, pronouns are he, him, and I'm the head of product management at Postlight. It's a digital strategy, design, and engineering firm in New York City. And I'm so excited to speak now about planning and success. As we know, every good product is made up by a series of decisions that rely on best known evidence at the time. But when we product managers rally with our designers and our engineering partners to make decisions on behalf of what's best for users, we bias ourselves towards positive outcomes. And that's the right default orientation, but it's only solving half of the problem. So there is the blank space of opportunity of planning for negative outcomes, which means that we can avoid mistakes, that are predictable failures, and that we aren't safeguarded against first. So as I was preparing for today, I found a quote that I just had to share because it actually summarized this better than I could say. So it's a quote from Taylor Swift, and it says, "Just because you made a good plan doesn't mean that's what's going to happen." Honestly, I just think that's the core of what we want to do here. We want to plan for everything that we can, but we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So what I do want to say to start this presentation is that we should be hopeful. We should ship great products. But we should also know that our best laid plans hardly ever pan out the way that we want. So then what? How do we move forward? How do we get our new definition of success? And what will our clients think? How will our customers respond? So those are all great questions, and I'm hoping that we can shed some light on this topic today to give some mindset shifts. So first and foremost, I just want to say, planning to fail, it isn't negative or defeatist. It's just realism. The first tip here for today, it's a mindset shift. A strong PM knows all too well that no product is ever built without mistakes or bugs or stakeholder issues or risk. That's just what we're going to expect. So why not lean into that a little bit while planning? We often ask, how might we? But what about also asking, and if that doesn't work, then what? If that fails, how will we? So push back also on bold statements. Anyone that says, oh, this is easy, or that's just an edge case. True, we don't want to solve for every known problem, but focusing on what could go wrong with our solutioning actually points out risk and holes in the problem that we're attempting to solve. So before we dive in a little bit more, I think I should give some background on myself. I have a different background. PMs all come in different sizes and shapes, of course. So for me, my influential time of my 20s and 30s was spent working in a 911 emergency call center. So my worldview is on disaster planning and crisis response. Admittedly, that's a bias that I bring. With that, life or death was often in the decisions and risk mitigation planning that I had to make. That was oftentimes spur of the moment. If I think about this as a product, my product was help or safety. My users were usually ill or in distress or victims of a just committed crime. My features, so the tools I had available, were police, firefighters, medics, and then over the phone tips and tactics such as administering CPR or hostage negotiation. That's something I've actually used before. I became a master of asking questions and eliciting information. And I use this information to make split-second, life-changing decisions. Most of the time, I shipped success, but sometimes I didn't. Sometimes a bad outcome happened. So that's my worldview. And I think the important part of the story is bad stuff will happen. But fortunately for us, it's just software, and it's a bug. It's not death. So how does crisis management scale to software? Well, let me talk to you about how I think this is important in a learning that I took in my life. So back in my 911 days, we had what we would call frequent flyers. And so these are folks that would call repeatedly. There's one person in particular I'm thinking of. She never had an emergency. She often called someone was smoking cigarettes too close to her home, or the neighbor's vacuum cleaner was too loud, things that were just clearly not emergency, not super important. So over the course of time, her user behavior was defined through a series of interviews with predictable outcomes, very much nascent in terms of what the typical problem would be. But one day she called and she was having a medical emergency. And I've had bias, and this is the thing that I learned on this day. So when I saw her name and address pop up on the computer-aided dispatch display, I immediately settled into sort of my routine normalcy of calm questions. In my head, I was thinking, well, I'll start a report, I'll clear the ticket, no big deal. But I learned quickly her behavior had changed and her needs had evolved. So I had to respond immediately to this new requirement, this new user story, if you will. In the end, everything was fine. She was okay. And that happy outcome, it was transformative for me because I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't prepared for this new requirement. My mindset was set on routine and expected outcomes and behaviors, and just really kind of not thinking through, what might happen when I take that call. What could be the outcome of what that user needs. So I really took this as an opportunity to sort of shake it off and reset. So you're kind of applying that lens to crisis management and thinking about software. A few things that I'd like to talk through today is really focusing on outcomes over outputs. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what does success look like, but I also want to think about what does failure look like? How would we plan for that? What shape might that take? We know the outcomes that we want. We know the outcomes that we don't want, but we might get them anyway. And so we should start to plan and talk about what those actually look like. So apply a lens of the unexpected. A framework to think about this is in your users. Outputs is what you end up with after a series of inputs. Your inputs can be decisions, it can be effort, it can be features, but outcomes are what you're given and what you're left with at the end of the day. So outcomes are what you desire and the thing that you can most influence. You can influence this by influencing your users. You can change patterns. You can elicit motivations. You can begin to change goals and actions. The other part here is that as you do start to change outputs, your user behaviors likely will change. So think through a product when you're first designing a product. As you start discovering research, behaviors are completely undefined. But as you learn more, you begin to predict behaviors and you begin to start solving for them. Your product decisions are set out on how to support a goal that your user is aiming to achieve. But those users evolve and their needs will change. You should set clear goal lines as to what you will solve for, because you obviously want to make sure that your scope is controlled, but also have some variability within those features to create experiences that will scale as your users' needs evolve. Last thing here is the evolution of your customer needs. So for instance, as we all know, any company's main goal usually is revenue, and that's usually driven by adoption and continued engagement. But as your software is being designed and built, has the landscape changed? Has your users evolved? Think globally about factors that could create a recipe for failure. So taking this through, I'd like to talk through a case study for something that I've recently shipped. So I worked with the National Audubon Society, and just a couple months ago, we shipped just a gorgeous web app, if I may say so, called the Bird Migration Explorer. It was a 20-month program. It was multi-phased. It's one of the most technically complicated products with the largest data set that I've ever been part of. So planning was paramount to our success here. And end of the story first, we did launch on time, and the launch was boring, which is exactly what you want. But how did we get there? We planned. We had to plan a lot, and there's a lot of considerations. The key hallmark of this app is the aggregation of data. There's bird tracking data, bird banding data, abundance data, occurrence data, GIS data. I could just keep going on and on. The headline here is that these interactive animated maps paint the full annual migration for 458 bird species. And to do so, we have more than 4.2 million point-to-point migratory bird connections across the Western Hemisphere. So that's just one piece of data that we're showing, but there's a whole bunch of subsets here. But one of the tricky factors in our planning was that the Audubon Society doesn't actually outright own all the data. Actually, no one entity does. So we had to find partnerships and agreements, and we designed and built our app around having access to all of this data that we needed. We planned for success. Designs included these programs. The architecture and the schema supported having all of this data available. But what if we didn't get the data? What if we missed one piece? What if we didn't get any of it? How could I evolve my product vision to support the failure of obtaining this key data, integral data to our visual narrative? We had clear plans for how we could evolve the story for any missing data or all of the data, and still a plan to support users if our agreements weren't successful. This was done through planning, expecting different scenarios. We had contingencies, we had safeguards, and we had plans. Ultimately, we did get access to all the data, so failed plannings weren't needed. Additionally, our behaviors changed in our users. We first identified when we started this two primary users, birders and conservationists, so scientists. Both are well-versed in migratory birds. They understand taxonomy and guild and other attributes. But what if our mapping data and visualizations just weren't enough to keep those users interested? What if we failed to create a compelling reason to engage users to return to the website? This lens about thinking about not good enough or not offering a deep enough experience created some new features, and it also downscoped others, both of which added to the overall experience. We found ways to engage new users, and this is a personal story. As we're thinking of bird nerds and scientific conservationists, we wanted to also find use cases to get new folks into the app. So my target user became my mom. So the tooling that we eventually offered and came out with supports my mom watching birds in her backyard in rural Illinois, as well as these bird nerds and these scientific conservationists. So long story short, by thinking of how we may fail our users, we found ways to support their needs even more, and we actually even created new target segments for engagement. So one thing that I really love about UX DX is evolving from from project thinking into product thinking, and that aligns really well with how I approach product and how I lead teams. Without being negative or sort of seeking, as an anti-hero, I want to just ask some different questions, and I want to put a framework in place of how we might think about mitigating challenges. So a lot of times we focus on what does success look like? What is our MVP? What's the definition of done? And what does a successful launch look like? Those are all great questions, absolutely wonderful questions. But at the same time, we want to validate, thinking about more around success, we want to mitigate challenges along the way. So we have to validate all of our decisions for recovery against our product requirements to ensure that we have a bulletproof user story and solid acceptance criteria. So more than just a backlog or a story point. In order to do that, we want our features to be really well-rounded and fully vetted. So I actually like to think about other questions such as, what does failure look like? What could go wrong? And plan for that. What does our MFP? I just thought this was kind of fun. So our most failed product, like what is the worst thing we could put out there? And how do we not do that? Like plan to not do that. When is done enough good enough? Scope control is also extremely important. We don't want to continue to solve all the problems for all the users. We want to have some controls, but we also need to balance the line of being good enough, but also being done. And then what stops us from launching? So what are roadblocks that we might anticipate, and how do we start to handle getting ahead of those? If you don't plan for outcomes that include all possible outcomes, you're basically telling your users, hey, you're on your own, kid. You don't want to look back at your clients with a failed launch thinking about would have, could have, and should have. You want to think through what works. You want to plan for failure. So as we continue to move through our planning for failure, you're probably thinking to yourself, you need to calm down. Like this is software. This isn't 911. There's no hostage happening here. And you're right. Not everything is that bad. But these tips can help you ship a safer, better, faster, more inclusive, and scalable product. So this is just a bullet point of some things that came through. Again, we started with a mindset shift, but I also want to make sure that we're clear here that this is not just being negative. This is not being defeatist. So don't dwell in despair. When I think of client engagements, they're really exciting in that honeymoon phase during that project kickoff where the world is possible and there's eternal hope and you're going to do all the things that you want to do. Like, enjoy that, be in that moment, celebrate that time, because eventually an invisible string and an unknown constraint will show up. It's how you handle that and plan for that will undermine your path to success. So when something does happen that is unexpected, it's okay. You've planned for something bad to happen. You know it's going to happen. So enjoy the discomfort. And I know that seems like an awkward place to stay, but discomfort is a wake-up call that things aren't going well, and that you need to find a way out of the woods. Sure, you could run to the nearest daylight, but you could be running further into harm's way. Instead, stay in that moment and really analyze, why is there discomfort? What happened that led the team to this place? What went awry? What could go differently next time? How did my actions contribute to us being in this place? When you have all that data, you'll be able to then lead your team to the best safety, which might not be the closest safety. The third item here is be reasonable. Can't plan for everything. I can't imagine anyone would have predicted COVID changing our world or catastrophes or natural disasters. So you don't have to be a doomsdayist here. Scope to your planning for what you might expect and not global emergencies. So there is some normalcy here. Rely but don't die on data. Data is historical, and why data is great is the lesson in what suggesting what the future might be, but it doesn't guarantee the future. It doesn't construct how you'll get there. Data also sometimes has gaps. and biases. And users aren't data, they're humans. And humans are very complex. So humans will always foil best laid plans. Iterate often, see things in a different way, ask users different questions, hear feedback, and show new paths. User testing is the best real world sample for your product that you can ever ask for. And believe what they tell you. If they're having an issue with something, it's probably not working for them, and you might want to go back and figure it out. Think of obstacles, not just opportunities. If we want to action a particular piece, what might get in our way? What could prevent the user from completing this action? It's easy to understand, click this button, launch this screen, but think through the other way. How would the user not find that button? What if the user doesn't want to engage with that call to action? Those types of things to sort of find these patterns. And finally, turn the how might we into the what if this. Not all planning is disaster, is life or death, but the mindset shift is similar, and it'll pay rewards to your team and your product. And there's a quote that I like to think of through here is also being a tennis fan. As you enter into the halls of Wimbledon, there's a quote from Kipling that says, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same, I believe that in those moments, you will have earned your reputation as someone who delivers client and customer confidence in their product. Hopefully these tips will be helpful. I'd love to answer any questions that you might have.